A small glass case sits inside a building near Haneda Airport. Most travelers walk right past it. Inside, a notebook, open to a page where the handwriting starts steady and gets shakier with every line. Hirotsugu Kawaguchi wrote it, 52 years old, a message to his wife and children written somewhere above the clouds, the ground still miles below. He wasn't dying when he started writing. He had time. That's the part that doesn't make sense. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 lost its tail, lost its hydraulics, lost almost everything a pilot needs to fly a plane, and it stayed in the air anyway, for 32 minutes, doing things a Boeing 747 was never built to do. Long enough for a father to fill 7 pages, long enough for strangers to strap on life vests, hold hands, and wonder if the ground would ever come. Investigators would trace it all back to one repair done 7 years earlier, one row of rivets where the manual called for 2. 524 people were on board that evening. 520 did not survive. It remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. 4 people lived, pulled from the wreckage, from the plane's last 3 rows, roughly 16 hours later. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this happened, not just the crash, the 12 minutes before it, the 32 minutes during it, and the small decisions in between that decided who got to go home. Some of this stayed quiet for years. Some of it is still argued about today. So let's start where this story actually starts, not over the mountains, 7 years earlier, on a runway in Osaka. 25 people were hurt, none died. The plane got towed off for repairs. The damage looked routine, cracked skin, a damaged pressure bulkhead at the back of the cabin. Boeing sent a repair crew. The aircraft went back into service, good as new. It wasn't. Investigators later found the repair team was supposed to join the new and old sections of that bulkhead with 2 rows of rivets. Instead, they used 1. That single change cut the joint's fatigue strength by roughly 70%. Worse, the mistake was invisible. A correctly repaired bulkhead and this one looked identical from either side. No inspection over the next 7 years caught it. There was nothing to see. Just a hairline weakness, building quietly. Every takeoff, every landing, every time the cabin pressurized and depressurized around it. Engineers later estimated the flawed joint would fail after roughly 10,000 pressurization cycles. By the summer of 1985, JA1119 had flown thousands more than that. Nobody on board had any way of knowing it. Before we get into August 12th, hit like and subscribe if deep dives like this are your thing. And tell me honestly in the comments, had you heard of this crash before today? Because the next 32 minutes are unlike anything else in aviation history. August 12, 1985 fell right in the middle of Obon, the holiday when millions of Japanese travel home to visit family graves, one of the busiest travel weeks of the year. That evening's flight from Tokyo to Osaka was almost completely sold out. One passenger almost wasn't there at all. Kyu Sakamoto, a singer whose 1963 song Ue o Muite Aruko remains the only Japanese-language recording to ever hit #1 on the American Billboard chart. He usually flew a different airline, but Obon travel was too heavy, no seats left on his usual flight, so he booked this one instead. His wife wouldn't even know he was on this flight until she saw his name on the passenger manifest.
3 men in the cockpit. Captain Masami Takahama, 49, roughly 12,400 flight hours. First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, 39, completing one of his final training flights before his own promotion to captain, which is why the two had swapped roles for the evening. Sasaki flying from the captain's seat, Takahama supervising and handling the radio beside him. flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, 46, rounded out the crew, roughly 9,800 hours of his own. 6:12 p.m. 12 minutes behind schedule, Japan Airlines Flight 123 lifted off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport, climbing toward a cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, bound for Osaka. 509 passengers, 15 crew, 524 people, most of them just trying to get home. For the first 12 minutes, nothing about this flight was unusual at all. 6:24 p.m. 12 minutes after leaving Haneda, just short of cruising altitude, Flight 123's cockpit voice recorder picked up a loud bang from somewhere behind the cabin. A cabin pressure warning horn sounded almost immediately. Oxygen masks dropped. Within seconds, Captain Takahama squawked 7700, the universal signal for an in-flight emergency, and radioed Tokyo Control requesting an immediate return to Haneda. Nobody in the cockpit understood what had actually happened. A warning light suggested a problem with door 5 on the right side of the fuselage. For a few critical minutes, the crew believed they might be dealing with a door that had come open. They weren't. The real failure was happening at the back of the plane. The aft pressure bulkhead, the same one improperly repaired 7 years ago, had ruptured completely. Pressurized cabin air surged backward into the unpressurized tail section with enough force to blow off roughly 5 meters of the vertical stabilizer, along with the tail cone housing the auxiliary power unit. That single event severed all 4 of the aircraft's independent hydraulic lines at once. About 2 minutes later, flight engineer Fukuda confirmed it out loud. Hydraulic pressure was gone, all of it. On a modern jetliner, hydraulics move almost everything: the ailerons, the rudder, the elevators. Without them, a pilot's control wheel and pedals are connected to nothing at all. Captain Takahama, First Officer Sasaki, and Fukuda now had exactly one tool left to fly a 350-ton aircraft, the throttles. Nothing else in the cockpit still worked. For the next several minutes, the crew tried everything they had left. With no hydraulics, the only way to steer a Boeing 747 is by adjusting thrust on each of the 4 engines independently, easing one up, one down, to nudge the nose left or right. Pilots train for this in theory, almost never in practice. It's brutally imprecise. Tokyo Control suggested diverting to Nagoya, the nearest major airport. Captain Takahama pushed back. He asked for Haneda instead, better equipped, he reasoned, to handle a heavy emergency landing. Without its tail fin, the aircraft had almost no yaw stability left. It began drifting into a stomach-turning pattern investigators called Phugoid and Dutch roll motion, the nose pitching up and down in slow, sickening cycles, while the whole plane rolled side to side. At one point, it swept through a full 360-degree turn over the town of Otsuki, losing roughly 5,000 feet in the process. Witnesses on the ground photographed it as it passed, its tail fin visibly missing. Yumi Ochiami, an off-duty flight attendant riding as a passenger that evening, later said she spotted Mount Fuji out her window during the turn and briefly thought they were heading back toward Haneda. For about 18 minutes, the plane rose and fell between roughly 20,000 and 25,000 feet, unable to properly descend. Investigators later concluded that hypoxia, oxygen starvation from the unpressurized cabin, may have played a part.
Despite being reminded to use his oxygen mask,
Captain Takahama stayed focused on controlling the aircraft. Investigators later noted that the unpressurized cabin may have affected the crew's performance. Flight engineer Fukuda lowered the landing gear, hoping the extra drag would calm the pitching. It helped a little. It also made the rolling worse. Every fix came with a new cost. In the final couple of minutes, the aircraft climbed sharply, lost airspeed, and triggered a stall warning in the cockpit. The crew pushed the engines to full power. For a moment, it seemed to steady. Then, according to the cockpit voice recorder, Captain Takahama spotted terrain filling the windscreen. He called out a warning, ordered a turn away from it, while the crew fought for every foot of altitude they had left. It wasn't enough. 6:56 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 123 disappeared from Tokyo Air Traffic Control's radar. The aircraft's right wing clipped a ridge on Mount Takamagahara in Gunma Prefecture at roughly 340 knots, close to 630 kilometers per hour. The impact tore away part of the wing and the remaining engines. The aircraft rolled onto its back, struck a second ridge, and came apart. A seismometer at the University of Tokyo's Earthquake Observatory, more than 150 kilometers away, picked up the shockwave. It let investigators pin the moment of final impact to 6:56:30 p.m., precise almost to the second, from a machine that had nothing to do with aviation at all. In the final minutes, cabin crew had guided passengers into brace positions and life vests, standard emergency procedure, even though there was no water beneath them. Some passengers used those last minutes to write to the people they loved, the way Hirotsugu Kawaguchi did. Investigators later determined the crash killed most people instantly, not everyone. That distinction and what happened in the hours after is where this story gets even harder to hear. By the time Flight 123 hit the mountain, it was still broad daylight. According to U.S. Air Force accounts, a C-130 flying nearby spotted the wreckage within about 20 minutes and radioed the exact position back to Yokota Air Base. American forces offered to guide Japanese rescue teams straight to the site. A U.S. Air Force navigator later stationed at Yokota said the offer was declined at the request of Japanese authorities. A Japanese Self-Defense Force helicopter did locate the wreck that evening. By then, it was after dark. The terrain, steep forested ridgelines, no roads, made landing impossible. The pilot reported seeing no obvious signs of life from the air. Rather than attempt a night descent on foot, ground crews were sent instead to a staging area roughly 63 kilometers away to prepare for the following morning. Rescue teams did not actually reach the crash site until around 14 hours after impact. That gap became one of the most painful and debated parts of this entire story. Medical staff who eventually examined the wreckage found evidence that some passengers had survived the initial crash only to die overnight from shock, exposure, or injuries that might not have been fatal with earlier treatment. One doctor put it bluntly afterward, "If the discovery had come 10 hours earlier, we could have found more survivors." 4 people did survive that night. Yumi Ochiai, an off-duty flight attendant, Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter, Mikiko, 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, all 4 women and girls, all seated toward the rear of the cabin, on the left side, the section of fuselage that broke away and rolled down the far side of the ridge. If you've made it this far, drop a comment. Knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission spent nearly 2 years confirming what the wreckage had already suggested. Its final report placed the blame squarely on the 1978 repair, a single row of rivets where the manual called for 2, a mistake concealed under sealant,
invisible to every inspection that came after.
Boeing did not fight the finding. Weeks after the crash, the company told the New York Times outright that its own repair crew had done the work incorrectly. In Japan, responsibility for something like this doesn't stop at a technical finding. Within days of the crash, JAL's president, Yasumoto Takaki, told Japan's prime minister he was taking full personal responsibility for the 520 deaths and would resign. He did so months later, after personally visiting victims' families to apologize. The airline paid roughly 780 million yen, condolence money in Japan's terms, to victims' families without formally admitting legal liability in court. Two men tied directly to the repair did not wait for any of that. Hiro Tominaga, the JAL maintenance manager overseeing the work. Susumu Tajima, the engineer who had personally signed off on the aircraft as airworthy afterward. Both later died by suicide in the weeks following the accident. It remains one of the most sobering human footnotes to the entire disaster. The fallout reached beyond JAL. Domestic ticket sales fell by roughly a third in the months after the crash, with some travelers switching to All Nippon Airways instead. Aviation authorities worldwide ordered every high-cycle 747 checked for similar repair histories. Boeing redesigned the tail structure with a pressure relief panel meant to stop this exact failure from happening again, a fix that became mandatory across the global fleet. The four survivors' recoveries played out slowly and separately over the following year. Yumi Uchiyami spent months in rehabilitation for a fractured pelvis and arm. The following March, she boarded a commercial flight along the same Tokyo-Osaka route for the first time since the crash, telling reporters she still wanted to be a flight attendant. She returned to active duty for JAL months later. Keiko Kawakami had lost both parents and her younger sister. She went to live with her grandmother and older brother, working through months of therapy for an arm injured in the fall. Hiroko and Mikiko Yoshizaki lost Hiroko's husband and two other children in the crash. They rebuilt their lives together in Tokyo, largely out of the public eye ever since. The wreckage itself became something JAL couldn't look away from. In 2006, the airline opened a safety promotion center at Haneda Airport, displaying salvaged pieces of the fuselage, the actual cockpit voice recorder, and the handwritten farewell notes some passengers wrote in their final minutes. Every new JAL employee, regardless of role, is still required to tour it. Families of the victims, organized through a group called the 8.12 Liaison Association, climb Osutaka Ridge every August 12th to lay flowers at markers scattered along the trail, a tradition that reached its 40th year in 2025. The crash's influence reached other airlines too. Boeing redesigned the 747's hydraulic routing and added protective fuses so a single rupture couldn't drain every system at once. 4 years later, when United Flight 232 suffered its own total hydraulic failure over Iowa, one of the pilots aboard as a passenger, Dennis Fitch, had specifically studied JAL 123 and practiced the scenario in a simulator. Knowledge that helped bring that plane down with 184 survivors. 40 years on, Japan Airlines Flight 123 still holds a grim record. It remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in the history of aviation, the deadliest air disaster to happen on Japanese soil. No crash worldwide has come close to matching a single aircraft's death toll since. Pieces of it are remarkably still turning up. In 2022, road crews doing repair work near the crash site found an intact oxygen mask from the aircraft, buried in the mountainside for 37 years, likely surfaced by a typhoon a few years earlier. What came out of that mountain, though, wasn't only wreckage. It was a set of hard rules that changed how the entire industry inspects and repairs pressurized aircraft, and a company that rebuilt its safety culture almost from scratch.
On January 2, 2024, JAL Airlines Airbus A350 collided on a Haneda runway with a Coast Guard aircraft and caught fire. All 379 people aboard the gel jet evacuated within minutes, every one of them alive. Many observers pointed to exactly the kind of rigorous crew training and deeply embedded safety-first culture that JAL built in direct response to Flight 123, the kind of ending this story didn't get to have in 1985, delivered nearly 40 decades later. Every August 12th, families still climb Osutaka Ridge. A bell rings at 6:56, the exact minute the aircraft went down, and for a moment, the whole mountainside goes quiet. It's a story about a torn metal joint, barely the width of a coin, and about 520 people who never should have died because of it. Whatever changed in aviation safety after 1985 came at a cost no engineering fix can undo. If this series taught you something you didn't know, that's the whole point of making it. Subscribe if you want more of these, and let me know in the comments which disaster you want covered next.